and I think we're live. Hi, we're live. I didn't realize we were live. We were talking.
I wondered about that. When I came on, you were already live. You had one viewer.
Hi, friends. I thought we were live yet. I'm 51 and technology is still, things where I have to ask my kids for help. So now everybody knows that my house is a mess, literally, because I can't get to some of the stuff in my house. But I'm doing it from desktop now on Substack. So this is all sort of glitchy. You can do that now.
Oh, that's great.
Yes. So I did it last night and it was okay, but I did it now. And I apologize to everybody and my incredible guest, Heather Cox Richardson, because I didn't get to introduce you properly because I was complaining about my house being a mess.
But you know what? Doesn't that just symbolize where we all are? Like, people know who we are. Let's just chat.
Yeah, God, that feels so fucking good to hear because it's true. And honest to God, I think I want to talk to you about a million super incredibly important things because they're so important and no one talks about these things the way you do. But it's also, let's be real. I'm going to say what I was going to say to you without knowing all these people were here, which is I have my Christmas trees up. I have them decorated. That was a small feat in and of itself. But then I look around and I'm like, I just can't get to this other stuff right now. I can't get to the laundry, which just seems to be consuming my house. I'm pretty sure laundry reproduces. Does it do they mate? I'm not sure I ever had that many socks, but now, so it's just let's be real. It's fucking hard and you're overworked but you're a voice that we look to right now. People need your perspective. I just had Tom Malinowski on my podcast right before this, and he has a question for you I want to get to at the end because he wants your perspective on things. So, but thank you for joining me, and thank you for everybody for putting up with me just ranting right there.
So just a question though. Aren't your kids still at home?
Well, yeah, they're 12 and 16, and it's more frenetic than it ever was when they were toddlers.
So just for the record on laundry, think about it. Every day when your family changes its clothes, that's a load of laundry.
Yeah.
That really does. When they're little, it takes a lot of toddler socks to fill a washing machine. And then when they leave home, you're back down to yourself and your partner, and it's manageable again. But in those years, my great parenting invention, I can't believe I'm saying this publicly, was called the laundry game.
Okay.
And the laundry game was I would do all of the laundry on Saturday. The kids were little. And then we would play a game where I'd pile it all up on a couch, and I would throw pieces of it to each child and see how fast they could run it to get to their rooms to push it into a drawer. I mean, there was no folding, there was nothing. And they competed to win the laundry game. And I'm like, no, this is my contribution to parenting.
Kind of genius. Who needs Marie Kondo? Seriously, that's kind of genius because it's a game and that's the whole thing. Meanwhile, it still stresses me out because I should, I don't know if it's going to work at 12 and 16, but I would love to try. They probably roll their eyes and be like, are you fucking kidding me?
Oh, no. You can only do it when they're under 6. But boy, when I had a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old, and I guess an 8-year-old, man, it was a good game.
Like painting the fence, like in Tom Sawyer. Yeah, now, but yeah, and I don't know what it is with 16-year-olds with cups. Okay, so right, they take a drink of water and the cup goes next to the sink, and then they come back with another cup, and then all of a sudden there's 6 cups next to the sink. I don't understand why they don't. I promise you guys we're going to get into the important shit, but this is nobody talks about this. Why do they have to get a cup for every sip of water? What is that all about?
Well, just so you know, that doesn't go away.
Right.
And in fairness, I'm sitting here at this poor man's house, and I've got Pepsi cans everywhere and seltzer water and cups and,
Okay. Yeah. Full disclosure, I have 2 cups of water. And
there you go. It's genetic. And you ask why do they do it and where they get it? Come on.
Yeah. You know what? Come to think of it, yeah, fruit doesn't fall far from the tree. But let's jump in because your time is precious, and I do want to ask you about. I'm going to start with Indiana because what we saw last night in Indiana. You opened your show, your live with it last night. Let's talk about what happened, the impacts of what happened, and what that signals for where the Republican Party is. And I think of Donald Trump now kind of like the Bumble after Hermie pulls its teeth out. You know what I mean? It's it's big and scary, but it doesn't have any teeth. So I would love to get your perspective on what we saw happen in Indiana last night when it came to the gerrymandering.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. I do want to point out that, well, it's fair, I think, to say that the Trump administration and that Donald Trump might not have teeth with regard to the Republican Party. They still run the United States government, and that still has a lot of teeth. And there are people literally dying because of that. And so we're in this weird thing where you've got the administration controlling the levers of power in the United States, and this is not only Trump, of course, but his people like Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, Russell Vought at Office of Management and Budget, many of those different people. But in terms of what happened in Indiana and the idea that perhaps Trump is losing his Republican teeth, is that it looks pretty clearly as if the Republican Party is in real trouble in 2026 and 2028. And that itself is a really fascinating thing. And just for people who don't know, I did write the history of the Republican Party, so I know the party really well. The Democrats, I was actually working on a book about the Democratic Party when I started Letters from an American. So I know that pretty well, but there's very little of that in print. But uh, but it looks as if they are very concerned about losing that election. And that means a couple of things. First of all, it might very well mean that certain members of the administration get impeached. It certainly will mean, even if if they simply lose the House of Representatives, some pretty deep investigations. It just isn't going to go well before 2028. And of course, if the Republicans lose the 2028 election and a Democrat becomes president, it looks as if there might be serious legal repercussions for a number of people in this administration. So this is not simply, we want to still be in power. This is, we might be in real trouble if we are not in power. So what that's meant when it looks as if Trump can't put his voters into the voting booths the way that he managed to do in 2024, which was always tenuous because he promised everything to everybody. And I kept saying, you can't be wet and dry at the same time, which is what he has promised people. So what they've tried to do is to change the district maps by gerrymandering them going into the 2026 election, primarily the Republican dominated states that already had gerrymandered maps. It's worth remembering that Indiana's map is already gerrymandered. Out of 9 seats that go into Congress from Indiana, 7 of them already get won by Republicans and 2 by Democrats. This was an attempt to force the Indiana state legislature to put through a gerrymandered map that was so severe that, in fact, the Democrats couldn't win a seat, or it appeared that they couldn't win a seat. And the House in Indiana agreed to that. But the Senate did not. And a majority of the Republican senators, not just a few people, a majority of the Republican senators sided with the Democrats to say, this ain't happening. And, I don't have any connections to the Indiana State Senate. I don't know why they acted that way, but you can see them saying, at least in part, our voters don't want this. The voters in Indiana were very clear that they didn't want this. And I would emphasize that Indiana has its own quite independent frontier history. And I think that to some degree they're drawing on that. But then they also, I think, didn't want to be told what to do by a president whose approval ratings are in the mid 30s.
Yeah.
So what's interesting about that as a whole is that if you remember, Indiana was a state that gave Trump an early leg up in 2016. And said, this is not what we are looking for in a president. And so, again, most of us don't pay a ton of attention necessarily to state legislatures and what they're doing if you're not in that state. But this was a really big deal. And you can see that it was a big deal in part by how many people tried to get involved to force Indiana to do this, and about how they reacted when Indiana didn't do it, which is Trump backing off and saying, well, I really didn't care. Of course he cared. He had J.D. Vance and his son out there twisting arms. He threatened to remove all federal funding from Indiana, which was totally illegal. I mean, all of that stuff was there. Now he's saying, well, I didn't really care that much. This is, I think, a harbinger of the American people maybe finally having had enough of MAGA and being willing to turn somewhere else. And I'm not sure that's to the Democrats. I think it might be to a new political coalition.
Mm. That is very interesting because I haven't had an opportunity to speak with you since the elections we had here in New Jersey and Virginia and elsewhere. And this is an interesting progression from that point because it picks up, what you're saying about the American people, because we saw districts here in New Jersey who voted for Trump overwhelmingly. There's a town, Phillipsburg, which is in my district, which went for Mikey Sherrill, I think by 10 points, when that went for Trump in 24 very easily. And so it fits again with what's happening in Indiana and elsewhere. As the American people are saying, we've had enough of this. I also don't know where Marjorie Taylor Greene it will be going, whether that's aligning with the likes of Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson. But I want to talk about the elections that we had just even really a month ago or so in New Jersey, Virginia, elsewhere. Also, the special election that they just had in Tennessee, and what those numbers and that turnout and that pendulum swing back, what that tells you to pick up on your point about Indiana.
Well, and the mayoral election in Miami,
Oh,
putting a
right.
Democrat in the mayoral seat for the first time in 30 years. That's a really big deal. Miami's a fascinating city. Someday I'm going to actually get to just do local, and state histories because they're
Please.
really, the whole Indiana thing yesterday got me back reading literature from that Ohio Valley culture, which, most people didn't even realize they had their own 19th century literature. And anyway, so listen, I don't predict the future, but I will tell you that we have come through a period that looks, again, to me, very much like the 1840s and the 1850s, or again, like the 1920s. And that's one in which a number of people recognized that the government, the way it was currently operating, was not serving their interests, primarily their economic interests. And we know that from new studies coming out of MIT and Harvard that cable news, especially the Fox News channel, ignored economic issues in order to force cultural issues down their viewers' throats because there was an economic model behind that, a business model behind that, that if you focused on issues like race or guns or transgender athletes or whatever, you got viewers who otherwise would not watch a news program. So rather than trying to poach news viewers from other channels, it was more beneficial to try and create new viewers. And what we got then was sort of a feedback loop where lawmakers continually pushed cultural issues that benefited the Republican Party in a way that we had really seen since at least Reagan and probably before that, all the way back to the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision. But what happened with that, if you think about it and you think about 2016, I always like to remind people that Trump was the most economic progressive candidate in the 2016 election on the Republican side. People forget that because he forgot it. It never went forward. But if you listen to him in 2016, it was possible to hear him and think, this is it. This is my guy. He is going to make sure that money doesn't continue to flow upward, the more than $50 trillion that moved upward from the bottom 90% of Americans to the top 1%. And he's going to make things fairer. And the reality, of course, is we have seen just the opposite with him. And if you think about in the 1840s is what I've been really looking at now, but you could say the 1920s as well, you got a similar time when you got the rise of a new political party. In the 1840s, it was the Know Nothing Party. It was officially known as the American Party, but it became called the Know Nothings because if anybody asked about it, you were supposed to say, I know nothing, sort of pre-Sergeant Schultz. But they were organized around anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic sentiment. They were virulent, especially in Massachusetts and in New York. And it's actually, we get a long legacy of laws coming out of that have stretched well into the 20th century. But that's what they focused around. But the Know Nothing Party collapses immediately after the rise of the Republican Party. And the Republican Party, curiously enough, is pro-immigrant. If you read its first platforms in 1856 and 1860, they literally put in the platform, we want more immigrants. And yet they got a ton of Know Nothing voters. So what made that shift? Scholars who have looked at this say that, in fact, what the voters that joined the Republican Party from the Know Nothings, and what was really the thrust of the Republican Party in the 1850s, was its focus on guaranteeing that a small group of elite Southern enslavers did not take over the country's economic system and the country's government. So if you were a know nothing, what you were really up to when you were mad about the situation as it was with the Whigs and the Democrats and joined this anti-immigrant party was that you didn't like the people in control at the time because they were not serving your interests. So when you got the rise of a new political party that said, we're going to make sure the rich guys don't get everything, the know nothing switched over quite naturally, including some from leadership. There was a guy named Wilson in Massachusetts who becomes the author of a book called The Rise and Fall of the Slave Power. And that idea that we have gone through a period or are going through a period in which a number of voters were disaffected with the two majority parties, which makes sense if you look at the way people are now affiliated. We got a ton of independent voters that were coming through that, and people are saying, I joined MAGA not, and mind you, I'm not suggesting that racism and sexism is not central to those. That continues. But I joined that political party because I thought it was finally going to make sure that I had health care and that I got a decent wage and that I had housing. And what I have found is that I'm getting screwed even worse than I was before. And so I am open to something else. And that something else, I think, is what we are in the process now of creating.
Mm. I mean, that's just so incredible that you have all of that in your brain. But seeing them sending Donald Trump out to this end in Pennsylvania the other day to be the messenger for affordability, which he is telling his own voters is a hoax and a con job. When again, this really sort of lines up with what you're saying too, because now he's trying to gaslight people who are looking around saying, no, everything's more expensive. This is much harder than you said it was going to be. I mean, we talked about the price of eggs, and now he's standing up on stage telling your kids to go with fewer dolls and fewer pencils like they have in China. I mean, it's like he's clearly not the messenger for that, but he has abandoned, if he ever had a core principle, that at least that arm of it, and to stand there in front of his own supporters and tell them, oh, the affordability is something that the Democrats have made up. I mean, watching that in real time, I'm like, he's basically insulting them to their faces. And you could feel the room, the energy. Something was clearly not landing. And I think that this is part of what you're talking about, where they're like, wait, hold on. This is not what we talked about. And you're looking at me and you're still telling me you're pissing down my back and telling me it's raining in front of my face. That was my assessment of that.
Well, and I would go beyond that and say, well, that's definitely the case. It was weird. That, and then what he posted later on in the day, the thing about pencils, I just thought that was weird. When was the last time in your life, I mean, actually, it's happened in my life because I'm a writer, but when was the last time pencils were front and center in your version of the world? I just thought that was so weird because, when I think of pencils, I think of Thoreau. Thoreau became who he was because his family made pencils. That's how he started out. But how often do pencils come up? I just thought that was the weirdest thing. And then the 37, 37, 37, you know, that is the other problem I think that the Republicans have, is that Trump's mental acuity is clearly slipping.
Yeah.
And, people say, well, is he going to run again for another 4 years in 2028, which of course he is saying he is going to, in order to turn people out to vote in 2026 and 2028. But remember, when we see him, that's him at his best.
Yeah. Yeah. And in that crazy thing you were referencing, that post, he talked about how he goes to Walter Reed often. And he actually said he's taken 3 cognitive tests, which I'm pretty sure are dementia tests. Isn't it the Montreal something assessment that he's talking about, where you have to identify a rhinoceros or an elephant or something like that? He's talking about acing those. But to say out loud that you took the test 3 times in front of many, many doctors, it's not the flex I think he thinks it is.
Well, so what's interesting about that too, though, is I don't think he wrote that. He definitely posted it. Well, look at it. So if you look at the run-on sentences, the difference in capitalization, the word aura, those are all things that are not usually in his vocabulary. So I don't know who wrote it, and I certainly, maybe he did. Maybe this is what he does in his free time. But I read it and I thought, this is very odd in a number of ways because it just didn't look to me as if he had written it. So what was the message behind it? Why would somebody write that and say, spend half of it? It's almost a full half of it that is dedicated to his mental acuity.
Yeah.
I don't know. I thought the whole thing was, you know what? Everything is bizarre these days. Just everything is bizarre. And then you got somebody like me sitting here going, oh, I'm not sure he wrote that. And, maybe he did because you don't have any idea what to trust anymore because everything is so slippery and coming at us so fast. It's very, very difficult to make a good portrait of it in real time because you just got to see how it shakes out.
Yeah, and it often feels like it's coming from every single front. And I back to the top of this conversation where it feels overwhelming, and I think a lot of that is by design. I think it's just also by virtue of the fact that they have a lot of dismantling shit that they need to get done. But his health and his mental acuity, it did the hypocrisy of this being the thing that they said was the greatest scandal of the Biden presidency and the Biden administration, the biggest cover up, and we're literally looking at a cover up on top of a cover up as it pertains to his hand, which we're now being told is because of him handshaking to me. So what is he shaking hands with, a gibbon? Like, what is he shaking hands with? Like Edward Scissorhands? Like, just but it's and it's very interesting to hear you say that you're not sure he wrote that, and then it makes my mind wonder what that seed is that somebody might. And again, we're just guessing here, right? Because we don't know, but why someone might plant that seed, that there is something that he might be signaling, that they might be signaling is coming down the pipeline as it pertains to him and his fitness. And sort of that opens the door to this last part of the conversation I kind of want to pivot to, because maybe that's a move towards putting JD Vance into that position, and Donald Trump has exceeded his usefulness at this point, and they don't need him anymore. But JD Vance, on the other hand, he's been out there very publicly, like you said, in Indiana, but also pushing this nativism, this blood and soil, which is ironic given that he's married to an Indian woman, and his children are half. But I was talking, like I said, to Tom Malinowski before this conversation. We were talking about the national security strategy document that came out, and how really one of the things, to boil it down in very basic, like, Cliff Notes terms, one of the things in it is that we're telling our European allies, unless you stop allowing immigrants into your countries, we don't want to play with you anymore. And so now we're seeing this policy of blood and soil here, this nativism here, jumping the ocean and impacting our approaches to national security abroad. And Trump's also been talking about, Europe might not exist. He said that out loud recently. So historically speaking, while they're calling Antifa a domestic terrorist threat, the number one domestic terrorist threat in this country, and kind of cozying up to far right and fascist groups in Europe, I'm just like, from your perspective, that document, if you've been doing any digging in it, if you've read it, if you're familiar enough with it, I had to pick Tom's brain about it because I feel like it's also not getting enough attention, because it is a pretty seismic shift in terms of who the United States is telling the world we are. And like you said about immigrants in the beginning, when we were talking about sort of the 1840s and the Republican Party being pro-immigrant, to see where we are now, and that document in particular, this national security strategy, I would love to get your perspective on that too.
So yes, I read it. Actually, the minute it came out, I saw it come over my social media feed, and I'm a sucker for government documents. And I'd been waiting for that. So I read it, and it was quite late that it came out. It was on a Thursday night. And then I wrote about it the next day at some length, because it is, in fact, a white nationalist document that echoes Nazism and says everything that you just said. But what's interesting about it, there are a number of things that are interesting about it. The thing that jumped out to me at the time was the fact that it embraces the idea of spheres of influence, which are what we had before we had the post-World War II idea of a rules-based international order, which essentially creates a web around the world of trade and different institutions, both financial institutions and political institutions like the UN, like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or NATO. It created this web to make sure that if any large country or strong country decided to invade its neighbors, that there was a gang essentially ready to kick them back out, which is what NATO is. It's a defensive alliance. This walks away from that concept and instead decides that, or argues that, the United States really needs to control South America. And it doesn't really mention Canada and Greenland, but it's pretty clear that Trump wants the United States to have control of the Western Hemisphere, and that opens up Russia to take over Europe, and it opens up Xi Jinping to take over the area around China, and Narendra Modi to take over India's sphere. There are many, many, many problems with that. The first of which being that opens up the ability for these great powers to have major conflicts, which led to things like World War I and World War II. But I think Trump likes it, first of all, because Putin likes it, but also because essentially it treats Latin America as a colony of the U.S. We're going to come extract all of their resources, and somebody's going to get rich. And I promise you, it ain't you and me or the rest of everyday Americans. But that being said, first of all, there's been pushback against that from the Congress, the United States Congress, and certainly from different diplomats. But the place I want to go with that is somewhat different, because a colleague of mine wrote to me after, I guess it was shortly after it came out, and said, why haven't you written about a book from 1916 called The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant? And the simple fact of the matter was, I was so focused on the geopolitical implications of the national security strategy that I wasn't really thinking as much as I should have been about the racial implications. And that book that I just mentioned is a book that argues that Western civilization is racially based. That, this is the whole Nordic people are the cat's pajamas and all that. I paraphrase, but you get the point. It also suggests eugenics to get rid of undesirable races. I mean, it's everything that you imagine when I say 1916. And it becomes so popular in the right-wing circles in Europe that Adolf Hitler actually writes to the author in the US and calls this book his Bible, right?
Mm.
Okay. But the kicker to this book in the United States is that it's really never very popular.
Mm.
It sells about 17,000 copies, which is a lot. It's not 12, but it falls out of favor very shortly after its publication. So by the 1930s, Americans really aren't behind this. So if you think about the periods written 1916, and the guy's not a historian, he invents all this stuff. And then you think about that period is the one where you're starting to see the rise of the second KKK, the second Ku Klux Klan, which is focused on purifying the country, not just of Black Americans, but also of immigrants. You get the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment. You get this whole flood. And yet, by the 1930s, this book has fallen into complete disrepute. And then you think again about the political implications of that. And you look at the fact that in the 1920s were the Republican decade, right? You've got the election of Warren G. Harding in 1920 simply because he can fog a mirror, and I'm not exaggerating by much. You got the continuing election of people like Calvin Coolidge, and then by 1928 you've got Herbert Hoover winning in a landslide in 28. It looks like this is the direction the country is going to go. The economy crashes, and the Republican Party slams into a brick wall. And in 1932, you get the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, and a complete reworking of American society under the New Deal. So that document is horrific. The NSS document is horrific. So is the Passing of the Great Race from 1916. That's horrific as well. But what really jumps out to me in both of those cases, and you saw this with former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, talking about this on social media, this is not a popular position. And when you think about J.D. Vance taking over for Trump, which is where what your lead into this was, J.D. Vance is 100% embracing this. He's the one who defended those young Republicans for their Nazi talk, said, they were just kids, even though some of them were in their 30s and probably still leaving glasses of water around their mom's house. And he is definitely going down that road, trying to pick up the sort of Groyper side of the young Republicans. But the American people are just not behind this, I don't think, as a majority group. And the kicker going forward is going to be making sure we're very, very, very clear about this. And even those people who might embrace racism and sexism themselves need to be aware that once you have put in position a government that can go after people based on their race or their gender or their ethnicity or their language or their jobs, you fill in, or their religion, it is only a question of time until they come for you.
At first they came for. And Tom Malinowski, again, the last thing I said before I get to his question, he cited a poll. I don't know from where, and I apologize, I'll find it. But where he did this question about what Americans support in terms of immigration and refugees coming into our country. 67% of those polled said they're in favor of continuing allowing refugees to come into our country. Only 3%. 3% of the people polled said they wanted exclusively for white South Africans. So you're right. I mean, this is deeply unpopular. Tom made a joke. He was like, you know how hard it is to get 3%? He's like, you ask your neighbors, if the earth was flat, you'd get like 4 or 5 or 6%. But to get 3% is deeply unpopular. And it's true. And I think in many ways, that's another thing where I feel like they're trying to gaslight us. But I also think that it makes sense, again, to your point about, about the people waking up and saying this was always true, but they're saying enough of this is what it feels like to me. And it's not what we're seeing with these ICE raids and the disgusting, dragging of people. There was a mother who was going to see her baby in the NICU, who our friend Jessica Craven posted about, who was taken on her way to see her baby in the NICU. And I think all of that, the visuals of all of that, coupled with this being not who we are, and them telling us that this is who we are and not only where we're going, but where Europe is going, or will punish them. I am hopeful that this is going to help with that pendulum swing coming back as well. But I will end with Tom's question for you because it's a perfect place to end. He asked about hope. He asked about, as a historian, your objective perspective on where we are and what history tells us about where we are in this moment, in this, this sort of what feels like a vice grip, in between a slide into authoritarianism and or the continuation of this experiment of American democracy. What gives you hope looking back anecdotally at what's happened throughout history?
Well, I can look back, but I can also, in this case, look forward. I have no doubt, none, that the United States of America and eventually most of the world will adopt a democratic system that serves the needs of the most people. And why do I think that? Because I believe that for human beings, the concept of self-determination, the idea that we get to figure out who we are and what we want to do with our extraordinarily brief time on earth will always win out. Americans, and I shouldn't speak for any other country because I'm an Americanist, Americans are not going to give that up. So when I think about where we are, I was thinking about this the other day. When you study Puritanism, which is the group of people who come to the United States in a great wave beginning in 1630, some of the great historians of Puritanism said, they were kind of an unbeatable combination because they believed that they were going to win no matter what, because they believed God was on their side. And I guess I believe I'm going to win because I believe humanity is on the side of human self-determination. So if that's my philosophy when I think about American democracy, which, by the way, has never been perfect, but that's part of the story of American democracy. When you talk about immigrants coming to this country and people embracing that idea of immigration, that's because the real story of America is not having something. The real story of America is striving for something. And immigrants, Black Americans, women, we're the people who define America because we are the ones who are constantly creating who we are and trying to create a nation that enables us to be who we want to be. But when I think about this particular moment in the light of history, I think it's pretty clear that we are looking at a small group of reactionaries, primarily made up of white older men, who are determined to make sure that they continue to stay in power and are doing everything they can to leverage the different pieces of this administration to keep themselves in power. And they are not going to give that up easily. So while the momentum is certainly on the side of those of us who are trying to protect democracy, the next several months at least are going to get worse and worse rather than getting better and better. And one of the things that I urge people to do is to remember, at least the way I think about it, that we are going to win. Maybe not tomorrow, and maybe not next week, and maybe not next year, and maybe not in my lifetime, and maybe not in my children's lifetime. But this is a winning ideology. It is essentially the definition of what it means to be a human being. And so long as we have humans, we will have people striving to be able to create themselves and a world for themselves to live in. So the quicker that will happen, we will win the most quickly if we all work incredibly hard at it now. And that's what I would urge people to do, is to remember that we are fighting not for a political party. I don't really care about political parties. We're fighting for a nation, and we're fighting for humanity. And those things are worth showing up for quickly, doing a lot for, and that will win in the end.
Well, I'm a crier, and I'm full disclosure, like trying not to ugly cry right now because that gave me so much hope. But also, my dad came here as a teenager from Lebanon and seeking, a better life. And he worked for 50 years for the Department of Defense because he believed in the experiment and the promise of America, and he still that instilled that belief in me. And so hearing you say those words out loud, just I'm sorry, but ugly cry. There it is.
Well
Yeah,
well, but that's the other piece of what we're doing is, thanks to new technologies and thanks to the fact that we can organize around these fundamental principles, we're making a community.
yeah,
You and I didn't know each other 10 years ago,
yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And that, I think, is just, I mean, that's the good side of all of this is, we have this one of the things that I love about what I do is that the framers of the Declaration of Independence were always talking about the fact they had this extraordinary opportunity that almost nobody in human history got, which was to start everything over again. Thomas Paine says we have it in ourselves to start the world over again. And this is our time. We get to start the world over again, and we get to do it as a community, which is totally cool.
Yeah.
For all the hard work, I wouldn't be anywhere else.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for quoting Thomas Paine. I saw Jimmy Raskin speak recently. He quoted him as well. So Thomas Paine is not going quietly into that good night, and neither are you, Heather Cox Richardson, and the 5,000 people who are here. You are this community too, and I am so grateful that I had this time with you. I did not expect to ugly cry. Full confession, I ugly cry a lot, but you filled my cup in ways that I can't thank you for enough. And thank you to everybody else for being here. Heather, have a wonderful, happy, hate, safe holiday season, and stay warm up there. And thank you so much. And cheers to you with my mini cups. Uh, thank you. I'm going to try the laundry game with my 12 and 16-year-old until they tell me to fuck off. All right. Well, listen, thanks, Heather.
Have a great holiday. I'll see you in the new year.
All right, I'll see you later. Thanks, everybody. Bye.